Whew boy, this is going to be a spicy one. Alright, today we're going to be talking about something near and dear to my heart. Swords. Something I would normally otherwise prefer to keep out of my heart. This one was actually requested by a couple of my followers so far, so I decided to go along with this one. I'm actually pretty experienced with Mugai Shinden Ryu Kenjutsu and a little of the Italian Bolognese school of swordsmanship, so I'll try and remain as unbiased on this topic as possible. First, we'll go over our Wikipedia glossover, and then I'll try and dispel some of the swordsmanship myths forged by pop culture. A sword is an edged bladed weapon intended for manual cutting or thrusting. Its blade, longer than a knife or dagger, is attached to a hilt and can be straight or curved. A thrusting sword tends to have a straighter blade with a pointed tip. A slashing sword is more likely to be curved and to have a sharpened cutting edge on one or both sides of the blade. Many swords are designed for both thrusting and slashing. The precise definition of a sword varies by historical epoch and geographic region. One thing of note before we get too deep into this is that swords are actually trash weapons. Now, before you go to blow up my comments over this, let me explain why. In its historical setting, the sword is more of a sidearm than a go-to battlefield weapon. Unlike most weapons, they have a long cutting surface, an advantage it has over spears and axes. But it suffers from its inferior range, and as a result, the polearm was the undisputed king of the battlefield. Well, at least until guns became accurate enough to reliably shoot the ground. The sword was merely something you grabbed when your long-distance face shanker broke. Let's discuss some of the blades from Europe first. Something to keep in mind is that the names of swords are quite flexible, and there is always a lot of debate regarding classification of them. But the reality is that lexicon has varied over time. For example, what is a great sword but a California king-size longsword? There has never been a strict definition for them based on their lengths or size. Hell, 9 times out of 10, the words used to describe them were just the word sword in their native language. For example, this is called a spada. Do you know what that means in Italian? Yeah, it's sword. Very complex, I know. And this one is spadone, or two-hand sword. So those cheap replica mall ninja swords you see at the gas station could all be called dao, because the junk was most assuredly made in China. Despite the subtle differences between them, the close proximity of European nations to each other caused many of the swords' design to remain consistent with one another. Blades from Spain, Britain, Italy, France, and Germany tend to be quite similar, with relatively little deviation between them. Curved-edged swords are typically associated with Asia and the Middle Eastern nations, but there were quite a few that did gain popularity in Europe. One of the earlier designs was the Messer from Germany, the name meaning knife because its hilt construction was usually identical to that of a common kitchen knife, with 2 slats of wood sandwiching the metal tang. This one was often accompanied with something called a nagel, which means nail, which serves as a quillin or guard. A comparable weapon is the falchion. However, the falchion is noticeably thinner, making it more suitable for combat with its narrow edge. The Messer is a bit more robust, making an equal opportunity murder of both people and trees. There is also this myth that it was illegal for swords to be carried during the medieval period, but that's not exactly the case. It was, but only in some specific locations during specific times. And in other situations, it was actually quite the opposite, where it was a legal requirement to carry them. These were later followed by the saber and the cutlass, other similar weapons, but like the rest, they had their own highly specific jobs that made them better within their own contexts. The saber gained popularity due to the rise of shock cavalry, where a curved slashing weapon was more effective at recovering and delivering blows without getting stuck in a target. The cutlass, however, was shorter, making it a bit more useful to store on naval vessels and fight within the narrow confines of a ship. Few things are more embarrassing than getting shanked while you're trying to untangle your saber from the rigging. Everyone is pointing at you and laughing and dying. It's a bad time. 2 out of 5 stars. Wouldn't recommend. There is also the arming sword, a shorter blade that was often paired with shields or parrying daggers. Eventually, it evolved into what is called the short sword, which is often confused with a rapier. But again, that goes back to our linguistic issue. Is that a rapier or just a long short sword? Which makes it just a sword? I don't know, man, I just work here. Rapiers got characteristically longer and longer to give a reach advantage during the dueling popularity of the Renaissance. They are also unfairly accused of having no slashing potential despite having a very thin blade tip with massive acceleration behind it. You think getting smacked with a coat hanger by your mom sucks? Imagine one covered in razor blades. One of the main advantages of the sword over the axe is a much larger cutting ratio. Axes have a lot of power focused on a narrow point, but if you miss that point, you're hitting with nothing but shaft. No, I'll be serious, I swear. This is why axes were often the weapon of choice for the executioner, because the target wasn't expected to move much and could guarantee a more swift end than a sword. But there was one made specifically to remedy this flaw, namely the executioner's sword. Very clever name, I know. Which was thicker and heavier, since it required no nimbleness in the hand, and it had no distal tapering, giving it far more weight near the forward end. and since it was not expected to do any thrusting with its thicker shaft, they simply foregoed the tip. I'm sorry. I can't do it. Down in Africa and the Middle East, we have shuttles, Kopesh, scimitar, kotoba, and whatever the these monstrosities are. The shuttle originated in Persia and made its way into Ethiopia using its wide curve to hack into opponents around their shields. Evolving from battle axes, the Egyptians developed the Kopesh. Rarely more than 2 feet long, their short reach and weight made them obsolete by 1300 BC. Interestingly, the word Kopesh literally means leg because it was shaped like the rear legs of cattle. Also coming from Persia and refined in Iran is the scimitar, the grandfather of the Tulwar, Pulwar, Kilij, and Shamshir. Not exactly as broad at the tip as Hollywood portrays, the nomadic Bedouin tribes of the Middle East use these curved blades to great effect during their Ghazwa raids. The takoba comes to us from Sahel of West Africa. Straight and double-edged, they have more fullers, or blood grooves for the less informed, than most blades, ranging from 3 to 5. Strangely, the hilt is almost never bare metal and is often covered in leather, as the Tuareg people seem to have an odd sort of dislike for physically touching iron. Now, I clown on these can openers, but they are unique. Most of these bigger ones, like the iron ngulu of Bantu, were mostly used for executions, which should be kind of obvious given their shape. Alright, let's make our way down to Asia. Due to the wider geographic distribution of people, there is a far greater variability of weapon design. Here we have the Mandau, the Headhunter sword from the Dayak people of Borneo, the Da sword of Southeast Asia, the Kris from the Kingdom of Java, the Tulwar of India, the Jian and Dao from China, the Tibetan Kukri, and finally the infamous Katana of Japan. There are hundreds of others, but at the risk of making an 8-hour video, we'll stop there. The Mandau Headhunter sword is a little unusual in that it's noticeably broader near the tip, and is hilted with horn or animal bone, including sometimes human? Gross. But incredibly hardcore. Like machetes, they're relatively short, which made them great for taking on boats for raids or fighting in dense jungles. The Da sword comes to us from Cambodia, Vietnam, Siam, Thailand, Myanmar, Burma? Jeez guys, pick a name already. Characteristically, these cutting swords have unusually long handles considering they're most often used one-handed. But like the katana mentioned later, this gives them a bit more utility, allowing it to be used two-handed when desired. And it's not really part of the blade itself, but it is worth mentioning that it has kind of a unique sort of scabbard that's actually semi-conical shape, staying quite fat near the handle, but thinning down to a narrow tip near the end. Ah, the Kris. Who could forget Sumatra's favorite virgin sacrificer? These are found all over Polynesia and the Pacific. You could almost call them a knife or a dagger given their relative short size. Oh hey, it's that pointless linguistic argument again. Obviously, its most recognizable feature is its weird, squiggly kind of shape. Yes, that is the technical term for it. Come on, would I lie to you? Predictably, this wavy shape is not actually that consistent among Kris. Some have more pronounced waves than others, and usually the assumption is that the more wavy ones were more ceremonial or dress weapons. Mostly because this kind of serration was considered incredibly difficult to make, and doesn't provide a significant benefit in combat in relation to the aggravation you get for forging it. This is why serrations are historically rare in sword design. The Tulwar of India is probably one of my favorite forms of saber. And yes, I can actually use that term, because during the 19th century, many Tulwar blades were actually imported from Germany. As the go-to weapon of the Gatga martial art, it is one of the most slashing-focused weapons ever made. Literally by design. See this weird little disc on the pommel? It's theorized that this is actually to force you to keep your wrist straight, preventing you from moving in any way but a hammer grip. Which, while severely limiting in range, generates immense cutting power, a specialty of Indian martial arts that complements their brand of Khadga Vidya swordsmanship masterfully. There is also the Irumi, the ridiculous multi-bladed whip sword, which was unpopular for hilariously obvious reasons. We also have the Pata as well, the big brother of the Qatar punching dagger. These may seem cool on TV, but the lack of mobility in your wrist kinda negates any benefit you would get from the penetration power, another reason it was more of a brief novelty than a practical weapon. China is one of the oldest countries on Earth, so it's kinda hard to cover all the weapons they made, but the two most well known are easily the Jian and the Dao. Originally made from bronze around the 7th century BC, the Jian is a straight two-edged sword, while the Dao is a curved single-edged one. They are both referred to as being among the 4 general weapons of their martial arts. We also have the Fuu Tau, the iconic Shaolin Kung Fu blades of northern China, which, while gimmicky, were famous for their ability to catch weapons and manipulate their opponents. Let's talk kukris. Again, this is arguably a knife, or a short sword, depending on whatever vague hill you want to die on. These have gained great popularity recently due to the righteous kickassery of the Nepalese Gurkhas. They could be described as a sort of answer to the European messer, as, like most knives, started out as utility tools for survival in harsh environments, meaning they're actually a bit heavier than their size suggests. And the large downward curve focuses more weight than your parents' expectations, concentrating the impact and allowing them to function more like an axe than a sword. Down in Japan, the katana is probably one of the most misunderstood weapons ever made. Despite their reputation, katanas are relatively heavy weapons for their smaller size. While most cultures did differential steel hardening to varying degrees, the katana or its ancestor the Tachi sought to perfect it. Clay was placed on the spine of a hot straight blade, using any kind of fancy designs before quenching. This created a kind of etched design that would be called a hamon. Because the thinner edge caused it to harden faster than the clay-covered spine, it forced the blade to bend backward, creating its iconic curve. This gave the sword all kinds of advantages. While European swords were made to bend and flex under strain, the katana was not. Because of the wealth of iron in Europe, a soldier breaking a sword was no big deal. But in Japan, iron was scarce, and breaking a blade could mean a death sentence because getting another on short order would be no easy task. The solution was also provided via differential hardening, as the soft core prevented the blade from breaking. Instead, it would simply bend, allowing it to be more easily repaired by simply bending it back into serviceable shape over your knee. The Tachi, the older brother of the katana, was a bit longer and was worn edge down, but the katana was worn edge up. So why the change? Well, few things dull a blade faster than direct contact with wood, and running or any other movement caused the blade to bounce inside the saya, or scabbard. Wearing the blade edge up reduced that friction and kept the blade in pristine condition. Something that was actually noted by 19th century European soldiers when their sabers were constantly dulled by the metal interiors of their scabbards. The Tachi changed very little over its evolution, becoming the katana, okatana, uchigatana, wakizashi, nodachi, and tanto, all of which are essentially the same with only length of blade or quality being the defining factor. Deeper into the Pacific, the Kiribati people and other Polynesians were making swords out of anything sharp they could strap onto a pole, famously shark teeth, or just any finely honed hardwood. And honestly, the weapons and grass armor they developed was pretty creative considering the limited resources available on those sparse islands. Props for ingenuity. Across the ocean, we finally reached the Americas. Since metallurgy was mostly limited to jewelry and sculpture, metal weapons were not exactly common, and the natives were only just reaching the Bronze Age when the first Europeans began to arrive en masse. Meaning that swords almost didn't exist at all, but were instead supplemented by flint or obsidian knives. However, the more southern Aztecs had adapted out the limited range of a knife by simply layering these pieces of obsidian between slats of wood, creating an improvised sword called a macohuitl. Or maybe an improvised club? Man, come on! The obsidian shards could be sharpened down to a scalpel's edge using a technique called knapping. Unfortunately, obsidian is a volcanic glass, making it just as fragile, which became evident when first coming into contact with steel conquistador armor. On the flip side, there were, probably exaggerated, accounts of macohuitl sharp enough to cleave the head off a full-grown horse in one swing thanks to this sharper-than-razor edge. It was good, it just wasn't that great against anything higher on the Rockwell scale. Now, it's inevitable that almost everyone is going to argue about which is better between the longsword and the katana. Anyone who isn't a total weeb or a complete knob of an Anglo fanatic is going to recognize that the context is going to determine which is superior, which, in my opinion, can actually be summarized simply by how the question is asked. Are either of these two the better weapon or the better sword? Because those terms are not interchangeable. Remember what I said before about how the sword is not a main battlefield weapon? It was designed for convenience, whereas a weapon is designed to kill a target regardless of how cumbersome it may be. Ergo, by my logic, I deem the katana to be the superior sword, but the longsword to be the better weapon. Over time, the swords of Europe got longer and longer, to the point of absurdity due to the growth of the dueling culture that became prominent during the Renaissance. And here lies our difference. Duels, fights, and battles aren't the same thing. In duels and battles, the longsword has a greater reach, and a good pommel allows the use of techniques such as the Mordhau or Deathstroke, a method of slapping the opponent in the face with your balls detailed in the Codex Wallerstein. But the katana is short and worn higher up on the body. Its downward curve further reduces its profile, making it convenient to wear in a way only replicated in Europe through arming swords or hangers. And sure, the katana may not be very long, but the point is that it's long enough, allowing you to draw and strike in a single motion in tight quarters in a split second's notice, something that just isn't as practical with a longsword. As we discussed before, the purpose of a sword is to be convenient first and foremost. If you were prioritizing lethality, you'd carry a spear. In a duel where you know exactly who, when, and where you're going to fight someone, you would generally prefer the longsword for its greater reach and utility. Assuming you're okay with not being a dirty monkey and bringing a polearm. In a modern context, I've always felt like longswords are kind of like making a 500 Smith & Wesson Magnum your everyday carry. Sure, it's more powerful, but at that point you may as well have just brought a shotgun. Historically, swords spent most of their lives hanging at your side, knocking over furniture instead of knocking the head off some obnoxious dickweed. But that's just my stance on the matter. Anyway, I could easily make an entire video on any one of these blades, but the requests I received weren't very specific, so I just decided I would make a decent generalized overview on the subject. I apologize if I missed your country's trademark life canceller, so maybe I'll make a sub-channel dedicated to arms and armor someday. If you want more on historical combat, I would highly recommend drifting over to Matt Easton on Schola Gladiatoria, Shadowversity, Metatron, Scholagrim, or Lindy Beige. Seriously, these guys really know their stuff and have a ton more content on this topic than I do. But if you like this video, you know the drill, and I'll see you next time. But until then, farewell.